Turning our attention to big tech's role in the attack on the U.S. Capitol, we want to break this down with Roger McNamee. He is Elevation Partners Managing Director and author of the book Zucked, has a recent op-ed on Wired talking about how the platforms could pay for their role in the insurrection. First, let me say thank you for joining us, because there's a lot to talk about here.
There is.
Mostly, I just want to get your reaction to the latest headlines, which was finally you get Twitter and Facebook, everyone taking all these steps to police their platforms, when in the past they would say, we can't. How do you react to this?
So, Adam, I think this is mostly about self-preservation. If we think about this going back to 2015 and 2016, we've been, as human beings, a little bit like a frog in water coming to a boil, that we really didn't appreciate how we were normalizing extremism under Trump. And what happened last Wednesday, where you had an insurrection inside the US Capitol, changed everything. I mean, if you think about it, people could not tell where the line was. But when you have a president of the United States and his enablers inciting an insurrection, and doing so, by the way, in plain sight over a period of a couple of months, suddenly the platforms realize that they have huge legal liability here. These events were organized on Facebook. Many of the platforms, things like Parler were operated on Amazon Web Services, distributed through the Google Play Store and through the Apple App Store. It had Twitter, which was the one amplifying Trump. And so all these things put together, everybody's looking at this going, we have a real problem, in no small measure, because I think they understood there were more attacks being planned. There still are ones being planned for the 17th and the 20th. And, if you're running one of these companies, it's a little bit like the test of pornography, right? You can't define it, but you know it when you see it. And they're clearly in deep trouble here. And as they should be. I mean, let's face it, it's not just the insurrection. I mean, the reason we have not been able to deal with COVID is that our pandemic response has been very heavily affected by disinformation. Obviously, the election itself was buried in disinformation. So if we look at this, we really do have huge issues here. And I think we're finally going to have a reckoning.
Well, Rogers, going off of that, then you say that it's important for these social media giants to, quote, pay for their role. That's what you recently wrote in an opinion piece. I guess the question then is, how do we do that? What needs to be done to make sure that they are held responsible? Because I think that is the crux of the issue at this point.
Yeah, Shauna, this is a really important and I think a very difficult question. But let's take the extreme that happened yesterday night or at midnight, which is that Amazon Web Services pulled the plug on Parler after both Apple and the Google Play Store had taken it out of their app stores. Now, Parler was one of the places where the insurrection was planned and where a lot of the angriest voices were operating. And I think everybody realized that Parler was behaving so badly that there was no justification for it being allowed to exist, at least for those companies to support its existence. And without their support, the thing wasn't viable. That exact question, I think, needs to be asked about Facebook, about YouTube, about Instagram, about Twitter, because their role is, very much analogous to the role of Parler in this thing. They're much bigger companies. They do some good things as well as bad. But the reality is they have moved forward. Their business model is genuinely harmful. And I do believe that you're going to see a very serious debate about the limits that need to be placed on these companies and what that means for the business model. I think it's very unlikely that they can escape this without significant change. But I think the degree of change remains to be seen. I don't think we have any idea, and I don't want to make a forecast here, but I expect antitrust intervention. I expect regulations relative to safety that will create both corporate and personal liability for engineers when they do something harmful. And then you'll also see privacy.
Roger, breaking this down a bit, there's that documentary, Social Dilemma, which motivated a lot of us. I no longer have any social media on my phones, only on the computer. But you pointed out in your article, in your op-ed, Facebook's own research reveals that 64% of the time a person joins an extremist Facebook group, they do so because the platform recommended it. Can the government regulate the kind of algorithms that reinforce the worst within us to then choose to join groups that amplify that?
That is such a great question. And I think the right way to think about this is as follows. I am not in favor of censorship. I do not believe any corporation should be put in that position. I think what we're seeing today, you have to look at the situation with Trump as an exceptional circumstance, that he really is sui generis, and I don't think there is anything comparable. I don't want to see censorship. What I want to do is to regulate business model choices the same way you regulate them in, say, the chemicals industry. Remember, in the 50s, it was okay for chemicals companies to pour mercury into fresh water or spew toxic fumes into the atmosphere. And the country decided it would no longer allow that. So it would regulate the business model. And I do think it is entirely appropriate to regulate the business model for companies like Facebook and Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, so that they do not have incentives to amplify the most extreme content. Because keep in mind, as things stand today, hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories are not incidental to the business model. They're actually the lubricant for it because they're the most engaging content out there. And these guys have built businesses around it. And not only that, they're also in on the grift. They make money from advertising that is adjacent to this really hostile content. And that's what we need to regulate. And again, we've been down this path before. Went through it with chemicals, went through it with pharmaceuticals at the turn of the 20th century. We went through it with the building trades in the late 19th century. And this industry is too important to be allowed to undermine public health, democracy, privacy, and competition. And I just expect us to make very smart choices around that. I don't think it happens overnight. But if you're an investor, you have to factor this in and start to plan on an environment where there's a new generation of tech companies that come along with less harmful business models that we're all going to get to invest in.
Roger, I have a question, just going back to what you were saying about advertisers, because I think there's two sides of this argument. But after we saw what took place last week, I think the question is could we see maybe another boycott or companies a little hesitant to advertise on some of these social media platforms if changes are not made? I'm curious just if you think that is a possibility at this point then.
It's a great question, Shauna, and I would only hope so. I mean, let's face it, for the last 40 years, the American economy has focused on one thing, right, which is shareholder value. The tech industry is focused on a separate thing, which is efficiency. And the problem is that when you do that for 40 years in a row, you create an economy that's incredibly brittle. So if you get a pandemic, there's no way to respond and make enough PPP or to create enough tests. And as a consequence, I think our economy is incredibly brittle today, and we're going to have to make changes to fix that. But this industry, because it's so focused on efficiency, is actually in conflict with things like self-determination and democracy, which are inefficient by design. And so if you're an advertiser, you have to look at this and go, I am associating myself with things that are bad for self-determination, which if you're a marketer, people being able to make free choices is what drives your business. And these guys are actually getting rid of that. And then secondly, do you want to live in a country that's not a democracy? And, I do think that kind of soul searching is going on. I don't know how long it's going to take to play out, but I do think in time, the country's going to make the right choices. And I do know that there's lots of ways to have successful tech companies that are not harmful. And it would be really nice to see some people with incentives to do that. It may take a whole new generation of managers. It may take a different set of funding sources because, the current generation are so committed to predatory business models, they may not be able to adjust.
Roger, we're going to keep you around. And when we come back, we want to talk about the fact that you were an early investor with Facebook and the fact that you now say the problem is that their goal is to replace humans in many of the core activities of life. But you helped make this possible. So let's talk about what's next after this.